I watched the country turn red on a television screen while sitting on a couch, and I imagine the historians years from now will try to convince the world that everyone knew this was coming. The United States presidential election cycle always feels long, but this one, most prominently featuring Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, felt exceptionally draining, and it didn't help that the year itself was mired in seemingly endless tragedies, particularly a summer that opened with a terrorist attack at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, which killed 49 people and wounded over 50 others. In July, on back-to-back days, police officers murdered 2 unarmed black men, Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota. Philando Castile was murdered while reaching for a permit to show that he was allowed to carry the weapon he informed an officer that he had in his car. The officer shot Castile in the torso several times. His girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, live-streamed his death on Facebook. It was a jarring scene. Castile bleeding to death in his car's driver's seat while Reynolds asked the officer why he shot Castile in the first place. In all the videos of black people dying that had begun to more prominently circle the internet, none of them had ever been broadcasted in real time. It is one thing to watch a life slip away from someone as they age, expecting them to go, but to watch death snatch a person while scrolling through a news feed littered with pictures of dogs or posts about vacation plans seemed too surreal. It felt as if the portrait of death could arrive at any time and turn your face to it right when you'd forgotten it. Castile's case got more attention, in part because of the unique nature of the filming and the general idea that his killing seemed very blatantly unjust, though the police officer, Geronimo Yanez, was acquitted in June of 2017. I found myself more fascinated by Alton Sterling, who sold CDs. Sterling was what most neighborhoods would call the CD man. In any neighborhood I spent my youth and adolescence in had one. Every high school in the Columbus public school system had one. When I worked at the mall in my late teens and early 20s at a shoe store called Underground Station, the CD man was named Tony, and he'd come in every Thursday because he knew that's when the direct deposit hit for everyone in the mall. The CD man sometimes has DVDs, and sometimes has electronics, and sometimes has free advice. The CDs and DVDs aren't like the ones you can buy in stores. They're burned copies, sometimes with cheaply printed out album art on the cover. But for that, you get a deal. Sometimes one CD is $7, but you could get 2 for $10, or 3 for $15. It was a blessing for those of us who were young and trying to hold on to what money we had, working jobs, selling shoes, or coffee, or books in a mall for $8 an hour. Tony took requests, which is all I ever hit him for. I had my own CD burning software at home. It's so funny to say that out loud. But it was all for the hassle to get old discs from the library and burn them, which is like actual theft, I think. Like before you could get prosecuted for like downloading some shit off Napster, you could just like get a CD from the library and burn it, which feels more egregious perhaps. And yeah, that's those books of CDs I have in my house. That's all they are. Maybe I should get rid of them. I once requested that Tony bring me all of A Tribe Called Quest discography because at that point, I still only had them on cassette. And this was the early 2000s when cassettes were relics and CDs weren't far behind, but still had currency in my car with its custom installed CD player that cost more than the car itself. He returned next week with every Tribe album in chronological order with printed out album art for each one and a handwritten track list on the back. He charged me $20 for the whole lot. After I left my job at the mall, I'd see Tony from time to time on the block selling CDs out of a plastic bag. We'd always say what's up, and I'd ask him how business was going, and he'd tell me slow, but I'm doing all right, until I stopped seeing him altogether around 2007 or so. I later heard that he'd gotten busted selling crack outside of where the old mall used to be. He got linked up with someone from out of town and was pushing all their work for them. He got sentenced to 10 years, I was told. CDs became became less of a needed entity, and hustlers adapt to their environment. But Alton Sterling just had CDs and DVDs. He sold them outside of the Triple S Food Mart. He was a neighborhood fixture, sitting outside the market with a table from the afternoon until the early morning, playing music and selling CDs and DVDs to people passing by. He kept his business going by being tuned into the community and its needs, despite the fact that CDs by 2016 were not the preferred medium for music listening, and DVD players were all but a thing of the past, relegated to the graveyard by streaming services. But if someone wanted classical music or a DVD of a film from the 1960s, Sterling would track it down, sometimes within 24 hours. The neighborhood he sold in was dangerous and worried his loved ones, in whose name he hustled. But what people might not understand is that there is no mercy like the mercy that comes with being loved in a violent place. If you're vital to the fabric of even the most vital place, that place will keep you alive for as long as it can. And Sterling was vital to the Triple S Food Mart and the people around it, but he still carried a gun. Because stories began floating around about other CD vendors being robbed in the area. And so, when police were called to the Triple S Food Mart in response to a man threatening someone with a firearm, there was Alton Sterling. And sure, after Sterling's death, the store owner specified that it wasn't Sterling who drove him to call the police, but when they arrived, Alton Sterling was there. He was there and large, both hard to miss and hard to control. I think often of how someone large and black is seen as a vessel for love or a vessel for fear, depending on who is doing the looking. When Sterling was tased and wrestled to the ground by police, his gun fell out of his waistband, and I don't need to tell you how many bullets followed, or that the officers eventually walked free, or that the Triple S Market no longer has a CD man, or that Alton Sterling didn't get to go home to the people who worried that a neighborhood would kill him instead of a country. Whenever there is a black person murdered at the hands of police, and then also a video of it, there's a lot to process: anger, fear, resentment, anxiety. But with Sterling, I was also processing what happens when music is ripped from a community in that particular fashion. When the person you rely on for a soundtrack bleeds out on a street at 37 years old, long before age might take them in a more peaceful fashion. The map of the United States turned red on my television on November 8th, 2016, and Leonard Cohen was dead, but no one knew that yet, and Alton Sterling was dead, and Philando Castile was dead, and more mass shootings were happening seemingly every week, and I guess this is what a country can get away with when people consider themselves afraid. Donald Trump won the presidency. In the coming hours and days and months, I will tell people that I knew was going to happen all along, which is only half true. There is knowing, and then there is hoping against the knowing. Halfway through the election coverage, which I told myself I wasn't going to watch in the first place, I decided on a whim to take a nap. Things were seemingly starting to break bad, and I imagined that maybe if I fell asleep, I'd wake up in a better or newer country. But when I did wake up, it was around 2 in the morning, and I stumbled into my living room to look at my phone, inundated with messages of anger, despair, and grief from friends, some of whom I haven't talked to in years. I didn't turn on the television. I stayed in bed the next morning. No one I knew had heard any of the Tribe Called Quest album that was promising to be released in just 2 days, on Friday, November 11th. The group hadn't released any singles ahead of the album, and outside of a small press run after Fife's death announcing the project, they'd been pretty silent about it altogether. I called in favors. I even asked the most reliable sources I knew, and no one had heard the record. On Thursday, I had to drive to Philadelphia to prepare to read poems in a room full of people. Thursday morning, I'd heard Leonard Cohen was dead. I didn't know he'd been dead for days. I thought it was the election that did him in.